I want to begin with a little group participation. And I need everybody to join in. Don't wait for your neighbor, just jump right in. How many of you would be willing to just be honest this morning and admit it? You love stuff. Would you just raise your hand? You love stuff. You don't have to say what the stuff is. Just say that you love stuff. I mean, any recovering stuff addicts in the place this morning? I want to find out. Most of us love buying stuff, don't we? And, getting stuff has never been easier. With the advent of the credit card and shopping malls and now online shopping and home delivery, there's virtually no end to the stuff that we can acquire. And it's so easy to acquire it. I mean, so much is available right now from the comfort of our home with free shipping right up to your front door. I mean, how cool is that? And somebody might say, well, it's Sunday morning, here we are at church. Why are we talking about stuff? Well, in the 66 books of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, God talks about the topic of money and stuff over 2,300 times. I mean, faith, belief, prayer, none of those even make it to 500. Most of them don't make it to 200, but giving and stuff and all of that kind of thing, it's over 2,300 times. It seems like God may be obsessed with stuff too. I want to put it to you this way. Those of you who are parents, I want you to try to think back to the time that when you first had your first child, and when they were born, they were perfect in every way, weren't they? Every other child paled in comparison. And then something happened. Usually it occurs around 18 months, and that's about when you discover that your child is a wretched sinner. That's when it kind of sets in. And you discover that suddenly their favorite word is no and mine, and you get your first glimpse into their sinful nature that is characterized by selfishness. It's a universal problem with humanity, and so God had to speak to this issue, and here's the reason why. The number one competitor for your heart and mine is money and stuff. That's the truth. There's no question about it that the number one competitor for your heart and mine is money and stuff. Now, as Christ followers, we want to be open-handed people. We want to be generous. Last week, we illustrated the difference between scarcity and generosity like this. We have this God's supplies graphic, and on the left side, we see that when God supplies, our tendency is to get into this cycle of scarcity where we consume, and then we lack, and then we fear. We use up everything that we have, we lack, and then we fear. We talked about it last Sunday. The cycle of scarcity can become a perpetual cycle in our lives if we're not careful. And see, the scarcity cycle, we need to understand, it starts in the mind, not in the wallet. The cycle of scarcity starts in the mind, not in the wallet. We're in week 2 of this series called This Is What We Do, and it's something that we need to talk about. And if we're going to talk about this, we better know what this is. And we defined it last week that this is generosity. Every choice you make, your personal lifestyle decisions, your personal patterns and behaviors in life can all point back to the way you choose to think about this. And my hope is, my prayer is that the Lord is going to stretch all of us in our thinking about this in this series. Because the scarcity cycle does begin in the mind, not in the wallet. And scarcity, sadly, is the common outlook of today. We see it all around us, and that's not who we're to be. That's not who we want to be as Christ's followers. We are to embrace generosity. So because in this cycle of scarcity, what happens is, as I said, we consume, we lack, we fear. We consume, we lack, we fear. But in the cycle of abundance, what happens is we give, God multiplies, and our faith grows. We give, God multiplies, our faith grows. Now, I want you to be honest with yourself. When it comes to the issue of generosity, is this what you do? I've been asking myself the same question, is this what I do? And is it what I do on a consistent basis? I mean, have you ever experienced the cycle of generosity where you've chosen to give, God has multiplied, and your faith grew? I mean, Scripture tells us that, it's clear that God has a desire for us to do this. There's nobody could argue with that. We understand that. And so today we're going to look at the details of one of the greatest miracles that Jesus ever performed. This is not a parable. This is a true story of an event that is documentable. It actually happened. And here's Jesus together in Mark chapter 6. About 5,000 men had gathered, plus women and children, maybe 10 to 15,000 people altogether. They're there to hear Jesus preach. And it begins in Mark chapter 6, verse 34, when it says Jesus landed and saw this crowd and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. So you picture the scene in your mind. Kind of put yourself there if you can. The people are hanging on Jesus' every word. The time is passing by so quickly because they're so infatuated with what he's saying. And before they knew it, it was dinner time. Everybody's getting hungry. Verse 35, by this time it was late in the day, so the disciples came to him and they said, "This is a remote place. It's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." See, it's dinner time and they're a long way from home and there's nowhere to buy food. And the next verse is where things begin to get dicey, because they get dicey all because of one word. I want you to see if you can guess what it is here in verse 37. It says, Jesus answered, "You give them something to eat." See, I underlined that one word to kind of give you a clue. Guess which word helped it to get dicey? It's that four-letter word, give. You give them something to eat. And I want you to notice what the disciples said in the last half of that verse. They said to him, "That would take 8 months of a man's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" See, the disciples are preoccupied with what they're going to have to spend. But did you hear Jesus say anything about spending? He didn't say, "Go buy them something to eat." He said, "You give them something to eat." He just said, "Give," and they jumped to this conclusion. And Jesus asked them then a very important question. He wanted to know in verse 38, "How many loaves do you have? How many loaves do you have?" He asked, "Go and see." And then they found out and they came back and they said 5 and 2 fish. 5 loaves, 2 fish. What I want you to see is that day on the hillside, there were 2 specific perspectives that prevailed. There were 2 radically different mindsets. There was one group, and this would have been the majority, I think. It would certainly have been the disciples. They were all consumed with this scarcity mindset. Their attitude, their outlook was, there isn't enough. We're going to run out. The scarcity mindset says there's never enough. But interestingly enough, Jesus viewed this entire scene through a totally different set of lenses. He viewed it through the lens of abundance, which is the belief that there's more than enough. Now, for the sake of time, I know most of you know the story, and if you don't, I would encourage you to go back and read it today. But I want to fast forward to the end of the story, because at the end of the story, we see that everybody there on the hillside, 10,000 men, maybe as many as 5 or maybe even more, 5,000 or more children and women, 15 to 20,000 people have eaten and are satisfied. The disciples then cleaned up after these 15 to 20,000 people had eaten, and they had 12 basketfuls of leftovers. I envision bushel baskets of leftovers, and they started out with 5 loaves of bread and a couple of fish. See, the disciples' scarcity mentality, they looked at those 5 loaves and 2 fish and said, "This is not enough." And the abundance mentality that Jesus possessed said, "Oh yeah, that's more than enough." The scarcity mindset says, "What can I afford?" where the abundance mindset says, "What do I have?" And the abundance mentality knows that whatever I have, there's infinitely more where that came from. And that's how the abundance thinker thinks. As believers and as a church, this is what we are to do. This is who we are to be. I can't think of a better way to illustrate than the story of a couple of our Team World Vision runners. And I'm going to ask Chrissy Hubers and Nita Reeser to join me on the platform. Their stories are symbolic of a team of people who said yes And together, they all offered God what they had. And ladies, as I understand it, when this all kind of started out, neither of you were runners. You had never been out on the marathon circuit before. You're kind of hanging out at home, hadn't competed in a marathon, didn't like to run. And then last Saturday, November 3rd, both of you not only started, which I think is easy. I think I could do that. They started a marathon, but they finished it 13.1 miles later. And I love watching their stories unfold on Facebook, social media, and this is a case for the entire team. But I want to ask you, Anita, tell us first, what made you do that? Why did you do it?
I was already familiar with World Vision because Dave and I were sponsoring our first World Vision child after the Matthew 25 challenge that we had at the church. And I had done some research and really found out about the great work that they did. So when Steve Spear came to the church and challenged us again to move our feet for vulnerable children, I felt like that God was speaking to me and wanted me to say yes. This time he was not asking for a monetary donation monthly, he was asking for me. He wanted me to trust him that he would give me the strength to endure what I needed to endure to do something that I felt like was absolutely physically impossible for me to do. I struggled with the decision for a week. Eventually, obedience won out over comfort, and I said yes. And I'd learned from previous life experiences that when God asks you to do something, that he will allow you to put one foot in front of the other, trusting him, and he'll get you to your destination.
Good. So you said yes a year ago, and you wrote a check and started doing that monthly as a sponsor of a child in Africa, and then you said yes on a whole new level 18, 20 weeks ago. Chrissy, tell us what happened.
Yeah, so for me, I heard the same Steve Spear message. He came, his story inspired me, and I left with this nagging feeling of, you need to help. But I was like, well, Steve's the runner. I'm not, I don't want to do this. But the nagging feeling went out, and ultimately my heart really just broke for the people who are living without clean water. I remember hearing a statistic that half the children under the age of 5 who live in a community without clean water will die before their 5th birthdays. Well, I'm a mom of 2 young kids. I have a daughter who just turned 2 and a son who is 3, and so statistically that meant one of my 2 kids would die before their 5th birthday simply because they didn't have clean water. And I praise Jesus that was not my reality, that I had clean water, that my children had that, but my heart broke for the families who didn't. And so I wanted to do my part to make a difference and try to help.
Good. I'm thankful that's not your reality, but you made it personal and thought about what that would mean in your home and in your family. 3-year-old and 2-year-old, mom, wife to Neil, part-time nursery director here at The Point. If you weren't aware, if you don't have babies, you might not know that. It wasn't like you were looking for something to do. Anita, she's in a similar situation, full-time employee down at Schneck Medical Center. She's a mother of 3 adult children, has several grandchildren, and she's taking care of her husband. I know he needs lots of taking care of too, doesn't he? So these ladies weren't sitting around saying, you know what, I don't have anything to do. I need to find myself a part-time job of being a runner for World Vision. That's not the case at all, but they were busy, and they got involved, and they said yes. And tell us, Chrissy, what happened next after you'd said yes?
Yeah, so I signed up for the race. I went out and bought the expensive running shoes that they recommend buying to avoid injury. Started training. Week 1, I could not run 1 mile without stopping. Week 2, my foot got injured with those expensive running shoes, and I thought, awesome, like I'm 2 weeks in and I have already failed.
Oh, boy.
But I decided I have made this commitment. I'm going to follow through. I'm just going to take each day for what it is. So whether I was running 1 mile or 10, that day I just focused on the task. I started fundraising. That was another really hard part going into this. It's uncomfortable to ask for money, but I believe in the story that is being shared, and I believe in the cause, and so I started sharing it on all different platforms, and God just abundantly poured out his blessing in that, and people, many of you were so generous to give. And then I met my teammates. We met for team runs every Saturday morning, and I was inspired by them and made great friendships. Probably one of the most impactful things that happened to me during training was I started reading. And one of the books that I started reading was called The Ability to Endure by Michael Chitwood. Michael Chitwood is the founder of Team World Vision. And in his book, he just shares his incredible story of overcoming hardships and loss and then creating Team World Vision. Well, in that book, he talks about an ultra marathon called the Comrades Race that happens every June in South Africa. It's a 56-mile ultra marathon. You have 12 hours to complete the race. And when I read that story, I felt like you are going to run that race someday. Now, let me remind you, I'm not a runner. 18 weeks ago, I could not run 1 mile. I have never in my life ran more than 13.1. But when I read that, I had that feeling of, you're going to do this someday. And I kind of let that feeling sit. Then I started sharing with people. Some were very encouraging. Some were like, you have lost your mind. But I feel like that is a bigger dream that God has placed in my heart. And I'm not doing it to prove something of myself. I'm doing it because I feel like this is a way to inspire and encourage others to give, and people want to be a part of that. So my ultimate goal is to run this ultramarathon in June 2020 in Africa and raise 56 sponsorships for 56 miles that I will be running.
That's awesome. Very good. Anita, tell us what happened next for you. You said yes, and then more unfolded.
Well, I immediately started training, and Dave joined the team. And I had this vision that we would run the race together, we would train together, we would cross the finish line together. And that vision faded pretty quickly because he's a lot taller than I am. He's got long legs, and he can run faster. And he's extremely competitive, and he was not going to slow down for me. So I just continued to train, and as we got into the longer miles, they started taking a toll on my body. I got the first of several running injuries, and it became apparent that these running injuries had the potential to keep me from even making it to the starting line. So the reality of what I thought this was going to look like and what it actually looked like was really very, very different. At one point, I was struggling with physical pain. I was limping, and people are like, "You're running what?" as you're limping around. And I was struggling emotionally, and I had disappointment and frustration. And I was kind of having a pity party, to be honest with you. And God just really spoke to my heart, and he said, this really is not about you. This is about children that need safe, clean water and a future. It's about children who may live, and their mothers won't have to mourn the loss of a child who should have never died. So I just continued to train and trust God. And a week ago, on November the 3rd, I put one foot in front of the other, trusting God, and I completed my first half marathon.
That's awesome. And not only did they complete the marathon, but the fundraising part, which so many talk about, is so difficult. This is the number 2 and number 3 fundraiser on the team, $10,647, $6,000 between the two of them, well over $16,000, and enough funds to generate life-saving clean water for 333 children. For life, because you said yes. I think it's awesome. They confronted their fear, stepped out in faith, and they said, here, I'll give what I have, my obedience. I'll say yes, I'll show up, I'll do the training. I don't know how it's going to work. And just look what God has done. I feel like that's what they were saying out on the hillside that day as they were gathering up. The disciples had to be looking at each other saying, man, look at this. All these people have eaten, and now we've got these 12 baskets of leftovers just because God used what we had. And now we've got these runners that are doing the same thing. The cycle of abundance is where we give and God multiplies and faith grows. And that's the story I'm hearing from Chrissy and Anita, and I've heard it from several others. I want to hear you to just tell us specifically, though, ladies, before you go, how has your faith grown through this experience? It can't help but grow. Tell us how your faith has grown, Anita.
Well, my faith has grown. Obedience was a big thing for me during this. And obedience is a lot more than just saying that first yes. Obedience is saying yes all the way along the journey. When it gets really hard, you just keep saying yes. The other thing that I feel like that God, again, showed me is that when he asks you to do something, he will provide everything that you need every step of the way. The first thing was with fundraising. Fundraising is extremely difficult. It's almost embarrassing to go up to someone and ask them to give money. It's not comfortable. And I had set a big goal, and I said, this is just how I talk to God. I go, okay, God, this is the deal. I will do everything within my power to reach this goal, but you have to inspire people to give. And he did that in a big way, and a lot of that was in part to obedience and generosity of my church family. I really want to thank you for that. The other way that he provided, he gave me the physical and the mental strength to just do the training, even when I had to push through the injuries. Another way that he provided was he had his own agenda. Now, he had to get me out of the way first, and that was a little bit of a challenge. But race day, he provided everything that I needed. Although I wasn't going to have my vision of running with my husband, God provided me with a pace partner in Joyce Ray Ray. And we trained together, and every time we trained, she would be like, I love to train with you. You push me so hard. So I got her through the training, and I guarantee you, she pulled me through the race. The last thing that God did was race day. He gave me a beautiful picture of what it is in our Christian walk. Joyce and I had ran the first 10 miles. I had never done that in my life. We didn't stop, and the last 3 were doing kind of a run walk. And I was struggling, and she knew it, and she said, take my hand. And I took her hand, and I literally felt physical strength when I took her hand. So every time I felt weak those last 3 miles, I took her hand, and that's how we finished the race. We just put one foot in front of the other, and we crossed the finish line.
That's a great picture of the church. It's a great picture of what happens in groups when we just reach out and take somebody's hand and bring them along. And we all need somebody every once in a while to take our hand. And every once in a while, we're in a position to take somebody else's. Thanks for sharing that. Chrissy, tell us how your faith has grown through this experience.
Yeah, I feel like it's hard to describe what has happened these last 18 weeks in such a short amount of time, but I'll do my best. Ultimately, I just feel like my heart has been changed. I feel like I have found a passion for something that I haven't had in a really long time, and I feel like my passions are becoming more of what God is passionate about, and what breaks God's heart has begun to break mine. And I just want to continue to say yes to those things. When I started this journey, the enemy's words and thoughts in my mind were strong. You know, it was, you're not a runner. Who's going to give to this cause? You're not good enough. You can't do this. And I had to choose to say, you're right. I cannot do this on my own strength, but with God, all things are possible. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to fundraise, but I'm going to ask. I don't know if I'm going to be able to run this race, but I'm going to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And so I think just learning to be steadfast and faithful in what God has called you to is a big thing that I've learned.
You guys are an inspiration. The entire team is an inspiration. And, we serve a God of immeasurably more. He's taught you that through this experience, hasn't he? Let's give him a hand. Thank you for sharing. I thank God for what he's done and what he's doing. And Chrissy and Anita, along with other members of the team, asked themselves, what do I have? What can I give? And they gave. And God used them. And God blessed them. They gave, God multiplied their gift, and their faith has grown, and their story has been repeated again and again. And that blessing that they have already been will be multiplied, I believe, in the lives of others so many times in the years to come. See, generosity is found in the cycle of abundance. We don't just approach life from this scarcity mentality that says there's not enough. There's more than enough. There's an abundant supply. And that inspires people, because this is what makes such a difference in the lives of people. This is what turns strangers into friends, because of what he did, because of what Jesus has done. This is what we do. I hope you're beginning to see it, because this is where lives are changed. Did you recognize that in their story? Lives are changed on both sides of the equation when we are generous, and then for the recipient. And we heard great stories of that, and you'll be hearing some of those next week as you wrote those stories out. This story you wrote out last week, you'll be hearing more of those. But this is where lives are changed. When you open your hands and your heart, you will be amazed at what God can do. Many of us have this mindset that, we'll do this. We'll do it when the account is bigger in the bank, or when the kids are grown, or when all the bills are paid, or when the salary's higher, or when things get better. You know, this is what we're going to do when we'll be generous one of these days. Then we'll be able to give more and we'll be able to do more. And the problem is tomorrow never comes. That day never gets there. And see, one of Satan's big lies, he's just telling us, hey, wait, do it tomorrow. And, you know, a lot of people I've run onto through the years in sharing my faith, talk to them about where they're at, where they are spiritually, and say, hey, talk to me. You know, would you like to make a profession of faith today? You know, they're thinking, yeah, I would like to do that, but I'll do it later. I'm going to do that tomorrow. And they put it off. You know, we would never say, I don't want to do that. We would never say, I don't want to come to know Christ. I don't want to, you know, make a difference. I don't want to be generous, or I don't want to help. But it's easy for us to say, hey, I'll do that tomorrow. It's easy for us to put it off. And I just want you to be willing to admit that tomorrow never seems to come. I mean, for some of us, we've been promising God, you know, or maybe your mate or your kids or somebody else, that one of these days, somehow, somewhere, sometime out there, someplace, things are going to look different. And the problem is, you know, things have changed in a very positive way, but you still haven't stepped up. Jesus asked the disciples, he said, what do you have? I'm asking you this morning, would you be willing to ask yourself, what do you have? It's a question we could all ask. Would you be willing to say, God, everything I have, it's yours to use however you decide? The disciples brought forward a couple of fish and 5 small loaves. Anita and the rest of the team, they just brought what they had and they said yes. I love the post I saw last night of Sam and Diana Nolan drinking from their coffee mugs that just said yes. They had both said yes, and they had stepped up. And, you know, 20 people basically said yes to run in this marathon last week. And now we're at $51,050 later. What seemed like so little has turned into so much, and over 1,000 lives will be changed. Because little is much when God is in it. You might be amazed at how God could multiply what you give in obedience to Him. See, Jesus completely redefines what can be done with a little. And if you live with a scarcity mindset saying there's not enough, I'm going to, you know, run out, then your life's going to be marked constantly by fear and anxiety for the rest of your life. And that is not God's will for you. That is not God's purpose for you, because Jesus is the one who said over in John chapter 10, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. He's talking about the abundant life. And everything about the nature of God. It is extravagant and abundant and more than enough. That's just His nature. He's talking about abundance. And I want to give you 2 quick observations as we close. One is that God multiplies what He has blessed. God multiplies what He's blessed. Jesus took those 5 loaves and those 2 fish. He looked up to heaven and He blessed the food. And I'm just telling you right now, God's blessing is powerful, folks. And I'm not going to pretend to understand it. But when God sees a heart that has put faith into action, that's a heart that He can bless. I am convinced of that. That is a heart that can experience His abundance. He's just waiting for us to trust Him on that level. And then secondly, God multiplies what we give. God multiplies what we give. Do you ever wonder what happens in this miracle, Mark chapter 6? I mean, how did that come about? We know there were 12 baskets left over, but how did it happen? What we do know is Jesus gave thanks, He broke the loaves, He gave the bread to the disciples, and the disciples gave the bread to the people. In order to feed 10 to 15,000 people, I suppose there would be at least 2 or 3 semi-trailers full of bread. Wouldn't you imagine? I should have gotten with somebody that runs a restaurant to find out about this, but at 15 or 20,000 people ultimately, it would have to mean that there were semi-tractor trailers full of bread that it would have required. There would have been a lot of bread. So how did it happen? He gave the disciples the bread, who then gave the bread to the people. My point is, the miracle had to happen in the giving. It had to happen in the giving. The miracle happened as the bread left their hands. See, the Christian life is completely counterintuitive to this world we live in. Jesus said, if you want to find your life, you have to lose it. Now, here on this earth, that doesn't make a bit of sense. But guess what? In heaven it does. It makes sense there. Because we find our life through surrender to the one who gave His life for us. Jesus said, if you want to be great, you need to be the servant of all. That doesn't make sense here on this earth, but in heaven it does. So much of being a follower of Jesus is countercultural and counterintuitive. So what Solomon writes in Proverbs 11 should come as no surprise, where it says, one man gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty. A generous man will prosper. He who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. That doesn't make one bit of sense here on this earth, but it makes sense in heaven. That's God's economy. This is how heaven works. When we add, God steps in and he multiplies. And I just want us to learn to keep him first and to trust him to provide and learn to say yes to him always. You know, why does God want us to do this? Why does he want us to be generous? I think there are 4 reasons, probably a lot more, but I can think of 4 right off the top of my head. Because living with an open hand is an antidote to materialism. It also is the most certain death sentence to our selfishness. It reveals a different set of priorities. But the big deal is generosity makes us more like Jesus. Generosity makes us more like Jesus. Let's talk to him in prayer. Would you bow with me, please? Heavenly Father, I just want to pause in this moment and thank you for blessing all of us beyond what we deserve. I think we would all acknowledge that. And I pray that you would give us the ability, individually and corporately, to be courageously honest about where we are in this area of our lives. Teach us to live our lives with outstretched arms and open hands and open hearts. Teach us how to live with an abundance mentality. Teach us how to steer clear of this scarcity mindset. I pray, Lord, that you would show us your will and help us walk forward in obedience and faith and generosity. I pray your best blessings on every individual, every couple, every family that's represented here today as we seek to trust you more and more in the days to come. We'll give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.